tops. I'd also be sharing links in the chat. For example, link to the first decolonial conversation we had. I'll put in the chat box and stuff like that while we kind of wait for Nana's internet to come back on. Oh dear. Toby, I was wondering if we could just start the conversation, and maybe when Nana's internet returns, she can take the baton, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think we can start. I was just introducing myself in the chat box again. And maybe reach out to our second speaker, Dr. Uluwatoyi.
Yes, I have written to her quickly.
Okay, all right. Okay, so welcome everyone once again. We're excited to have this conversation. This is the second part of a 5-part webinar series, the Disrupting Colonial Legacies series. And today's conversation seeks to stay, critical to spotlight claims of justice embedded in climate organizing, international treaties and policies, local and indigenous climate justice movements, and bring forward arguments for structural transformations that take into account power relations and the continued legacies of colonial structures hindering indigenous thought, scholarship, and organizing. So this conversation, alongside with our speakers and everyone really on the call, we are hoping that at the end of the call, we have a deepened insights on emerging frontiers of ecofeminism and climate justice that is truly decolonial and liberatory. We also, since the start of this webinar series, we've been building solidarity across liberation and decolonial movements in Africa, and we are hoping that this conversation would also contribute to that. We also hope that we inspire feminist, Pan-African, and gender diverse liberation movements to spotlight and disrupt colonial legacies and the consequences of neoliberalism as it affects climate justice. I'm particularly excited that we are having this conversation because if we reflect on the ongoing conversations around climate justice, you will agree with me that most of the conversations have been, directed by institutions and bodies and movements, particularly from the global north, and thus, reducing lived experiences of African peoples to something that that might not be considered important. So I'm excited that this conversation is going to bring a feminist approach to climate justice that allows us to address climate change as a complex social issue and support an intersectional analysis that interrogates power relations that show up in gender relations, socioeconomic status, and all other, multiple sides of oppression. Before we, go into the conversation in full, I'm not sure if Nana is back or if.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Oh, yes, you are. Welcome. So I'm not going to take all of the time to explain, because I know that you would also have some reflections to share and also to give space for our speakers. So I'm going to hand over to you to continue the conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Toby, and welcome, a warm welcome to everyone. It's such a wonderful thing to have you all here on a day like this. My name is Nana Sule from Liberation Alliance Africa. I'm the communications person. Sorry, is someone saying something? Please, could we mute our mic? Let me just mute everyone for a bit. Okay. All right. So let's get back to it. Toby, I don't know if Dr. Adejon's around. Is she here yet?
Not yet, but I think Omolara is on it, so you can.
Okay. It's all right. I think we can just for now welcome everyone and our first guest that is around. Of course, like Toby mentioned, today we're talking about climate justice and all the nuances involved in it, you know, especially as a continent who has, we barely produce anything to generate so much greenhouse emissions, but we pay such a huge price when it comes to, you know, trying to fix the planet, get things back in order. And this is why, you know, we want to steer a conversation, you know, that spotlights the claims of justice embedded in climate organizing, international treaties and policies, local and indigenous climate justice movements, and bring forward arguments for structural transformations that take into account, you know, power relations and the continued legacies of colonial structures hindering the indigenous thoughts, scholarship, and organizing. So feel free to drop your comments in the comment section. We'll have questions later on. Just be as interactive as you want, share resources with us, sign up to our newsletter. I'm Omolara just dropped it. Just, you know, interact and meet everyone. Introduce yourself as you come on board in the chat box. Thank you so much. So while we have our first speaker here,
Sorry, Nana, to jump in.
Okay,
someone
please.
is commenting that the sound is very bad. I don't know if that is the same for, I can hear you clearly, but I don't know if any other person cannot hear Nana.
I'll just try to be more audible then, if that
okay
helps. I hope that helps. Okay, so today we have with us Najuko Joanita. I'll just read her bio briefly. She's a Pan-African feminist and activist. She currently works with Akina Mamawa Africa as the Program Officer, Economic Justice and Climate Action. Her work is premised on the intersection of economic exploitation and gender oppression and its implications for the achievement of broader women's rights. Najuko holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the Makerere University School of Law and a postgraduate diploma in legal practice. Drawing from her legal background, Najuko is dedicated to being an agent for social change and transformation, advocating for change in small and big ways. Najuko is passionate about building and organizing sustainable development models that center the needs of communities across Africa. So please, ladies and gentlemen, please make warm welcome to Najuko Joanita. I'm still worried that some persons are not hearing me properly. Okay, that's two persons who have complained about the sound. I'm not sure, could it be your network?
I can hear you, and I would like people to show their hands or raise their hands if they can hear Nana clearly, so that we can proceed. If you can hear Nana clearly, so that we know if it's not from Nana's end.
Okay.
I'm seeing show of hands, and
yeah, I think it's a function of the network. That's
yeah. All right, please proceed, Nana.
All right, thank you. So we're welcoming Joanita. Yay! Welcome. It's so good to have you here. I'm sure we're going to have such a wonderful conversation. So should we proceed before Dr. joins us watching, or?
Oh yes, of course. When she joins, she will continue the conversation. Like she would join the conversation. But let's continue.
Okay. All right then. We'll get right into it. Janita, hello. Hi, good evening. I'm sure I suppose it's evening where you are right now. Yeah. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. You look so wonderful.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much. So let's get right into it. Are you good to go? Is that okay?
Yes, I'm good to go. Of course, I was hoping to really hear from the doctor and just learn from her and the work that she has done. But like Toby said, I'm sure she'll join us. So I hope that I can do justice to the conversation and hold space as she comes on board. But good to be here and happy to meet everyone that is here.
Thank you so much. So yes, when the doctor comes up on board, we'll have her contribute to the conversation. But for now, we're going to learn from you, and we are confident that you're going to, do justice to this conversation. So the first question we have for you, Janita, is what are the implications for ongoing climate politics, policy making, and evolving power relations?
Okay, thank you, Nana, for that, and thank you to the LAA team for organizing this space and for inviting me to this space. Maybe just to say that I'm based in Kampala, Uganda, for those who don't know me and are meeting me for the first time, but I know that Nana did introduce me via my bio as well. So when it comes to the question that you have asked, Nana, on the implications for ongoing climate politics, policy making, and the different power relations, I think I'll start by mentioning that the current climate governance structure that we have is very neoliberal in nature. And in saying it's very neoliberal in nature, it means that it focuses on shifting responsibility for mitigating climate change onto individuals through their consumption of Western techno-scientific solutions, and it ignores the experience of differently situated persons. So when you look at climate change and the climate crisis, it has been framed as a problem of purely science, and inducing individual behavior change has been the key point of climate policy, and climate policy has ignored the social, political, and economic makeup of our society. And in ignoring this, it has meant that those who are already at the margins of society only continue to bear the brunt of the multiple and different crises that we continue to face. So I'll give an example of the Paris Agreement, which I hope most of us may know. It was the first ever universal and legally binding global climate deal. And this agreement does not in its entirety does not reflect the significant progress that has been made in understanding the intersections between structural and systemic inequality and climate vulnerability. Not only does this agreement make insufficient reference to things like gender, it also sets this binding target when it comes to limiting the rise in temperature, which has then directed the attention of policymakers, practitioners, toward measuring the biophysical aspects of climate change to the detriment of focus instead of on people and questions of social and gender justice. So we continue to see this push of all the 1.5, which is true when it comes to the climate science, but in the push for countries to reach that target, it focuses, it loses the focus on social and gender justice, and people are all looking at that target by whatever means possible. Because of this, when it comes to designing policies and actions to be implemented on the ground, policymakers don't engage with questions of power, which are quite critical when it comes to climate justice and issues of climate adaptation. That means that things like climate solutions are looking at things like planting trees and sort of addressing only the practical effects of climate change, for example, water shortage, fuel scarcity, instead of analyzing wider structural constraints when it comes to why the climate crisis is happening and why the need for climate justice. We also can't talk about climate politics without obviously talking about the current global economic structure that our world is set up. And at the center of our society and our world is the emphasis on export-oriented development models, specifically for the global south, through fossil fuel-dependent global value chains and private investments governed by global north countries. So powerful corporations and markets, which are controlled by colonizers, have become the foundation of our global economy, and this global economy has been underpinned by centuries of wealth drain, slavery, industrialization, extraction, and among other intersecting oppressions. And what we see now is that industrialized countries and multinational corporations are responsible for 79% of historical, not the current, but historical carbon emissions, and yet they are the least active when it comes to dealing with climate change. And they justify this inaction by arguing that reducing carbon emissions as required by the Kyoto Protocol will put their economies at a competitive disadvantage. So then we see that still the focus is on development, building economies vis-a-vis the everyday realities that people are facing currently when it comes to the climate crisis. And also these same global north and multinational corporations are discreetly pushing to avoid actual emission reductions with proposals to offset emissions through things like, I'm sure most of us have heard about nature-based solutions. And through these solutions, they claim that they can draw down carbon from the atmosphere, but in a critical analysis of nature-based solutions shows a reversal of roles and responsibilities, and those responsible for the crisis are putting forward condescending demands to people in the global south, especially Africa, that we should allow trees to be planted on huge areas of land to create what they call carbon sinks. And these trees that have been pushed are things like eucalyptus and pine, but now we have realized that these trees are what are now being referred to as thirsty trees, and they systematically affect biodiversity. They cause a dwindling of natural water resources, And of course, we know that those who are most affected by this are women and marginalized communities who depend on nature and these resources for survival. And these same people who are advancing and the proponents of nature-based solutions are the same players behind the massive deforestation when it comes to Africa's grasslands and savanna biodiversity. And I'm sure when it comes to African countries, a lot of us have seen this land grabbing and selling forests to foreign investors to pave way for extractive projects. And of course, this ends up displacing indigenous persons, displacing small producers in favor of foreign companies. And in this as well, it earns them carbon credits, which allows them to continue to burn fossil fuels. If you take the example of Mozambique, after almost 10 years of investment in eucalyptus and pine trees, the country has continued to face direct and indirect large-scale deforestation of native forests. So, yeah, the math is not adding up. Why cut down natural and indigenous trees in favor of trees that do not actually are not actually made for our land, and which are actually making the fertility of our land worse. If we even look at South Africa, the tree planting project alone has been responsible for the loss of 231 million liters of water per year. So in understanding and analyzing all that, we see and we know who is actually being the most affected by this. I know that South Africa really has a water shortage crisis, but it's always important for us to analyze and look at all these issues through a feminist intersectional lens, so that then we are not addressing them separately. And the last thing that I would say in that regard is that the impact on the reality is that the impact of the developed countries' fulfillment and on their current commitment to reducing emissions is still quite doubtful. And it's even more doubtful when you put into consideration emissions which are resulting from the extractive companies and corporations that operate abroad. So while for them in their countries, they're doing all these things, they're halting fossil fuels, they are pushing for renewable energy. Instead, their corporations and their companies are now moving abroad, especially in Africa, setting up mines, fishing trawlers, large-scale industrial plantations, oil and gas wells, all in the name of investments. And so it's essential that in doing all the things that the Global North purports to be doing, they need to also ensure that they are holding their corporations and their companies to account when it comes to the carbon emissions that they are then causing abroad, particularly in Africa. And of course, this is caused by things like neoliberalism, which I'm sure we will tackle as we continue the conversation. So yeah, I hope I have answered the question and laid some ground to the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. And yes. In fact, as you were speaking, I was like, oh yeah, you are headed in the very right direction, because you're absolutely right. Those at the margins are actually, instead of their lives getting better with these policies and interventions, they are even more marginalized and bearing the brunt,
Yeah.
which actually leads us to, I like that you mentioned neoliberalism, because this leads us to the next question, actually. How has colonialism and neoliberalism shaped the climate crisis, And how can the colonial approaches create the possibilities to address it?
Okay, maybe I'll start by saying that especially as Africans, we do not have the luxury of talking about the climate crisis without acknowledging why it is that we got here in the first place. I know that a lot of discourse and conversation comes in and says, oh, colonization happened many years ago. I wasn't part of it and all that, but it's important, especially as us Africans, to understand how colonization has shaped every core and fabric of our society. I mean, look at the language that we speak, look at the names that we have. I know at least that for West Africa and Nigeria, you guys really inspire us in terms of naming, not using colonizer names, but it has changed like the fabric, the core fabric of our nations and everything and who we are as a people. So it's really important for us to always have that historical lens whenever we are making arguments or thinking really about life as it is. So, of course, colonization played a significant part in changing our climate. And this is understood differently depending on how the story of climate change is told. And it's important that I say this because knowledge production and whose narrative and whose story is actually being told is important, right? In the context of histories and counter histories of slavery, genocide, colonialism, the question of who writes and tells these stories is quite crucial. There's been a lot of scholarship, particularly from the Global South, on the politics of climate change, and these have documented unequal geographies of power that are embedded in the environmental practice and climate action. But when it comes to Western hegemony and the dominant narrative, these decolonial ideas are invisible, and instead we see liberal narratives of technological advancement, things like climate smart agriculture, like all those narratives that that are not decolonial in nature and continue to exceptionalize Western countries for the crisis that we are in, essentially. So when it comes to neoliberalism, this is an organized program that is set to usurp democracy by replacing political decision-making with economic calculations. And neoliberalism has been the bedrock of the climate crisis, like I mentioned before. Neoliberalism was always a strategy used that use deceit to undermine progressive economic ideas in the same way that climate denialists are currently and continue to undermine the climate crisis. And the trick has been to give people the appearance of empowerment through individual choice and freedom. So you'll see narratives like, oh, paper straws, don't use plastic, things like that continue to make it seem like through individual choices, you're able to tackle the climate crisis. I mean, we see Save the Turtles and things like that. But in this process, it's dividing us and removing and discrediting the idea of society, the idea of holding government accountable, and the idea of common good. And the common good, obviously the climate and the environment are part of common good. So just because for me, I have AC, I have running water, I make my pledges here and there, I use sustainable straws or whatever that is, I feel that I'm okay. And so I do not fully appreciate the magnitude of the climate crisis. So that's what these systems of oppression and particularly neoliberalism does. And in Africa specifically, neoliberalism has been pushed through things like trade and investment agreements. I'm sure we all know about the structured adjustment programs, in bilateral investment treaties, things like the Energy Charter Treaty, and these have been the main blockages to achieving just climate action on the continent, because they then they limit the kind of environmental and climate regulatory measures that our governments are then able to implement. I know it is very easy to sort of come for the government because they are the people that we see, but it's important for us to always understand how Africa and our governments are situated in this global hierarchy and economic order. So when it comes to these trade and investment agreements, our governments, if they try to sort of bring out environmental regulatory measures, they are not able to implement them without having to pay huge amounts in compensation, and these are called indirect expropriation. So if governments dare to go ahead with actions, with such actions, companies and especially multinational corporations can use what we call investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which are always embedded in the treaties to sue our governments for the loss of current or future profits. For example, if we look at the Energy Charter Treaty, it's currently being used by big oil, big gas, and coal companies to discourage governments from, especially African governments, from transitioning to clean energy through challenging oil drilling bans, the rejection of pipelines, taxes on fossil fuels, etc. So you see the constraints and how colonization, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism are all working in this regard. Neoliberalism particularly has also created a policy vacuum which leaves corporate power unaccountable. So we've heard of many of things like corporate capture, and this is a direct result of neoliberalism. So things like trademark policies of privatization, deregulation, investment liberalization, and free trade deals, they liberate corporations to solely focus on profit maximization while treating the environment and the climate and atmosphere like a sewage dump, essentially. So in the absence of the necessary regulation to deal with the crisis, communities end up getting sugar-coated acts of corporate social responsibility. I'm sure we've all heard of that or are even proponents of that. So we see companies going to villages, building boreholes, building poorly equipped health clinics, which are voluntary and charitable. But here it allows corporations to market themselves as green, even as they go on polluting. So when it comes to corporate capture, they give you one thing and they come take over land, cause all these sicknesses, and then come in the same breath, build hospitals. But people would not be needing these hospitals in the first place if you are not polluting the environment in the first place. So it's really hypocritical of corporations, and this same corporation, thanks to things like widespread corporate tax cuts, industrial and resource tax giveaways, and the increasing use of tax loopholes and tax havens, these same corporations are the very same culprits for pollution and exploitative resource extraction, and they still avoid paying their fair share of taxes in the countries where they have economic activities and end up stashing these away in huge cash reserves. And of course, this means that then African states are not able to promote public interests and social welfare, which means that those already at the margins of our society who cannot afford private services end up bearing the brunt of a polluted atmosphere, the climate crisis, and essentially all the poly crises, as they call them now. That they end up bearing the biggest brunt. So I can end there for now.
Thank you so very much. We're really grateful for the contribution thus far. Really, you are absolutely right on some of the points that you raised. And before we get into that, Dr. Oluwatoyin is here with us. So please, you all will permit me to welcome her and introduce her to us. Dr. Oluwatoyin Adejomo is a senior lecturer at the Department of Public Law, Faculty of Law, University of Lagos, a solicitor and advocate of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, and the founding director of the Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development, the 3CSD, a research and advocacy-based not-for-profit organization in Lagos. She holds a PhD in international environmental law from the Faculty of Law, University of Dundee, United Kingdom. She is the co-editor of the book titled Climate Change, Justice and Human Rights, an African Perspective, published by Pretoria University Law Press, 2022. So please, a warm welcome for Dr. Oluwatoyin Adejomo. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry about the mix-up with the time, but it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here with us today. So we don't, spend so much time of people's time. I'll just like we've been talking about, the power relationship between the global north and Africa and the margins, basically, and how policy making and the climate politics in general, relates with that. And currently, Juanita was speaking about how colonialism and neoliberalism has shaped the climate crisis and how we can decolonize approaches, to create possibilities to address that. So I don't know if you have something to add to that before we continue.
Thank you very much. Interesting topic. Okay, so how has colonialism and neoliberalism shaped the climate crisis, and how has it made it worse? So you could actually say that colonialism started the fire and that neoliberalism made it worse. So I would dial back to 1960s, where we saw a rapidly expanding awareness of the threats to the natural environment. And this was notably through the writings and the research of Rachel Carson, an American scientist, who highlighted, the dangers of pesticides to the environment. So the 1960s also saw the emergence of modern environmental movements. And this was the beginning of modern environmental movements and also environmental litigation as well. And then the development of governmental policies for environmental litigation. However, with the rise of neoliberalism, and of course, we know that neoliberalism is that concept that promotes free markets, that promotes capitalism, that promotes deregulation, and also reduction in government spending and government regulation generally. It's also brought about less regulation within the environmental space, and the effective regulation of the environment. So environmental, and as a result of that, environmental protection was now seen as an impediment to economic growth and also competitive, and it was also seen as a competitive disadvantage for the countries and other jurisdictions that had, strict environmental regulation policies. So for instance, if we go back to the idea of sustainable development, we know that sustainable development actually aims to achieve environmental protection and economic development as well. But what neoliberalism actually promotes is that it promotes free markets. It has an undue focus on profits, on capitalism, on deregulation, and of course, in the reduction in government spending and government regulation of the environmental space. And what this approach has definitely led not only to the escalation of the emission of greenhouse gases, but it has also led to national and, if you like, to a global failure to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which leads to global warming and then climate change. And then, of course, which also leads to the degradation of the environment. And also, we can also link it. So if we want to link it to the colonial legacies, using the example of Nigeria, for instance, we would find that in the Niger Delta, that crude oil was actually discovered before Nigeria gained its independence. But the colonial legacy of that is that it led to unsustainable resource exploitation. And what happened was that even after Nigeria gained independence, we continued this practice of unsustainable resource exploitation. And this has been the legacies so far for a lot of African countries. I mean, a lot of African countries that have natural resources, be it Nigeria that is blessed with crude oil, that is also blessed with mineral resources like iron ore and gold, and other African countries as well. Unfortunately, the colonial legacies actually bequeathed to us unsustainable resource, that habit of exploiting for natural resources in an unsustainable manner. Another legacy is that because of the colonial legacies, we see that a lot of African countries that are endowed with natural resources did not actually translate into the manufacturers of goods and services. And that has kept Africa in this cycle of, poverty and so many of the other issues that that Africa faces. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so very much, ma'am. Thank you. That's such a wonderful contribution. It's always interesting to learn even from how far back these things have seeped into us as people and the way our structures, our systems, This is why I think the next question is important, and this goes to both you and Joanita. How does it mean to decolonize the contemporary climate justice discourse? Where do we even start from? How do we, when the discussion comes up, when the policies are being made, how do we start to, say, no, this does not work for our system. This does not work for who we are, So how do we go about that? Thank you. Janita, are you okay if the doctor starts, or? Okay, Dr. Luasa, I think you should just go ahead, please.
Okay, so following on from where I stopped, so I talked about neoliberalism and colonialism. And of course, what neoliberalism will do is that it would render the global south, and by global south, I mean developing countries in Africa and other developing countries. It would make them more vulnerable and less resilient in the face of climate change. And really, those are the issues that African countries face, because neoliberalism presents barriers to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we know that the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change are actually interdependent. So the question is, what does it mean to decolonize the contemporary climate change justice? I think one of the ways to start is to enhance or to improve the capacity and the ability of developing countries to be able to mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change, to be able to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, and then to be able to, build their resilience to climate change. Another way is to drive climate adaptation, or really any climate change policy and response to drive whatever response that we put on the table. Such response must put the people first. And by that, I mean that so climate change policies, adaptation plans, mitigation plans should not always be top to bottom. It should be bottom to up. It should take into consideration the perspective of vulnerable groups, not just men, but women within communities. And actually, women within communities are an important agent for change. When you consider their knowledge with regards to indigenous knowledge and the protection of the environment. So first, drive climate adaptation that puts people first. And then it's also necessary to build new institutions that would address loss and damage. So in terms of climate change discourse, climate change policies, and in fact, the COP28 that would be coming up in November in Dubai, one of the very big topics would be the issue of loss and damage. And so loss and damage, so it's important to build new institutions, whether global institutions or national institutions that would address the issue of loss and damage. Bearing in mind that developed countries who have actually contributed the least to the adverse impact to climate change are impacted the most, and that without the proper resources to protect themselves or to recover from these losses, it would be a challenge for developing countries, as we're beginning to see. So it's important that in order for us to decolonize the climate change discourse, that we begin to enhance the capacity of developing countries, whether through adequate climate finance. So when I joined, I heard Juanita talk about loans and grants to developing countries. It's important that developed countries do not, that there's a way in which climate finance is actually distinguished from loans and grants and FDIs that are given to developing countries. And also, it's also important that it's also important that this adequate finance must also take into consideration the needs and access to finance of vulnerable groups in the society, particularly women and children. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Just to recap, some of the approaches you mentioned was, to build capacity and resilience in developing countries, And it's really interesting. You're mentioning how to distinguish between the climate finance from the loans and grants, which I feel makes so much sense, because we African developing countries contribute way too little for us to be held accountable to so much. So Joanita, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thanks, Nana, and thanks to the doctor as well. Maybe just to start off from where you stopped on the issue of debt-free climate finance, in recognition of, we are talking about colonization and neoliberalism, when we are demanding debt-free climate finance is to acknowledge the historical carbon emissions that global north has caused, and so it's even reparations and not just climate finance. So I thought I should just add that as well. And in talking about what it means to decolonize, I will talk about a feminist, intersectional, decolonial, and historical lens. And such a lens and consciousness is indispensable to a future that is ecologically, economically, and socially just. And a feminist and decolonial approach, it resists the socially constructed hierarchies of, for example, race, gender, class, sexuality, and ability that is based on inequalities which underpin colonial, neoliberal, and capitalist structures. It recognizes that the current ecological collapse that we are experiencing is the direct result, like the doctor has said, of an unequal social contract in which these hierarchies continue to shape our social and economic relations. So when it comes to a decolonial stance, this means that we cannot deny that we live in a world where Black people, brown people, queer people, working class people endure acts of dehumanization every day. So these are their everyday realities. And that means when we are talking about a decolonial approach, it creates a new paradigm that forges active links between climate change, racialized and gendered labor exploitation, trade rules that, like the doctor was mentioning, economic structures that continue to reproduce and replicate inequalities. So essentially an intersectional approach when it comes to climate justice, because we know that we do not live single issue lives. Decolonizing climate justice also means centering the voices and aspirations and leadership of those on the front lines of the crisis, and allow for self-determination of communities that have been extracted upon for so long. Like the doctor was saying, who accesses funding, the strings attached to this funding, how that money is utilized, have all had a big role to play in exacerbating the impacts of the climate crisis. So when we are talking about decolonization, it means putting local communities at the forefront of determining which solutions are contextually applicable. And if I could highlight, I would highlight this, because when it comes to climate action, a lot of the solutions that we have seen are solutions that are being brought to us by the West. But how can the West that brought us to this problem in the first place be the same people who bring us out of this problem in the same vein? So it's important that we listen to people who have lived this reality, who have been able to adapt to the changes, the changing climate, listen to them and have solutions that come from them. So it means that those who work until our land, who grow our food, who fight to protect our natural resources, who understand the balances of nature and humanity must be protected. We've seen an increase in the murder of climate activists. So it's important that we do protect our people. And a decolonial approach for us on the continent means that we must reclaim African indigenous knowledge that centers communal ways of living and that centers community. And it also means decolonizing knowledge as well. And here we need to ask questions: who is producing what is classified as quote unquote knowledge, whose knowledge is actually being fronted? And I really like the introduction that Toby gave us and the importance of doing decolonial work and of changing the narratives and of changing histories and rewriting our histories for ourselves. And we also need to ask in decolonizing this knowledge, what are the vested interests of these actors whose knowledge and narratives are being fronted, whose history is read in the textbooks, whose philosophies, whose theories, whose methodologies are taught in school and university curriculum. I like that the doctor teaches lectures in University of Lagos, and so I hope that she's using knowledge that is indigenous and African to us. But also lastly is a feminist and decolonial approach means confronting institutional patriarchy and racism, acknowledging that within society there are people who are marginalized by systemic and structural oppressions, recognizing that these oppressions exist even when it comes to policy making. We need to prioritize indigenous people's rights and leadership. It means we need to confront exploitative and unsustainable production patterns, environmental racism, advancing reproductive justice, community-led solutions, and reject, and I'll say again, reject false and harmful responses when it comes to climate change, especially those being fronted and led by private sector, by Western multinational corporations, which we all usually fall culprit of, and they fail to address the root causes of the climate crisis. Yeah.
Right, thank you so much. That's a very wonderful, interesting contribution. So basically, you spoke about, the intersectionality of the approach that we need to, use, and then putting local communities in the forefront of policy making and all those things. Just like the doctor said, it has to be from bottom to the top and not just, making policies that might not even have a positive impact on those who actually need it. And then an interesting thing that you spoke about was decolonizing knowledge, which I am proud to say at Liberation Alliance, that's all we are about. That's a major part of who we are, decolonizing knowledge. It is so important to even recognize that some of the narratives are not our own, and to look for and find those things that actually belong to us and learn them over again, relearn and unlearn those that do not, were given to us, that might not be true. And I think you should answer the next question, because before we go to the doctor, we've been talking about how to, decolonize the discourse. But now let's speak on holding the global north accountable. How do we do that? Because they have contributed the most to this crisis, and they have left us with the consequences of this crisis. And yet they expect so much from us. But we need to sit and be like, no, this is time for you to, take responsibility for your actions, for your massive productions, for your capitalism. How do we do that? How do we hold the global north responsible for their contributions, to the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think I'll start by recognizing that a lot of activists and climate justice actors have done this work for a very long time. And of course, at times it can feel that there's no hope. There's this big thing and person that's doing that's destroying us, and we are too small to do anything. But I think it's important to recognize first that there's power in the people power. There's people power, and we have seen how communities have come together to push back on corporations. I mean, we see, for example, the Lamu women and the people in Lamu who rallied against coal mining in Lamu. So just to start from there and say that there is power in people coming together and pushing back on oppressors, and like you have said, in the different spaces that we are in, I think that we must always stress that Africa did not create this problem. And so even when we talk about, like the doctor said, whenever we are negotiating things like financing, it has to come from a place of reparation and restitution, acknowledging what the Global North has done and holding them responsible. We have seen the 100 billion pledge for all these years has not been able to like, they failed to come up with such monies, and yet we see that when it comes to other things, suddenly money can appear, for example, on the Queen's of England's burial, on the King's coronation. Suddenly there was a lot of money that could do all the ceremonies that they wanted, and yet we know that the UK is currently suffering from an economic collapse. So anyway, just to say that in whatever rooms that we are in, it's important to always to share our narratives and our truth, because it's easy to go in these big rooms and cower and say, oh, now I can take the crumbs that they give me. But it's important in whatever rooms that we are in that we speak about that. We also need to be talking about things like halting fossil fuel extraction, things like the effects of corporate greed and the mass extractivism and depletion of Africa's resources. We need to be talking about the politics of hunger and how things like food, water, and other basic necessities for human survival are being commodified, honestly. And we need to be talking about things like how African farmers who are feeding the continent continue to have huge taxes levied on them, while big multinational corporations and industrial farmers are the ones who are getting tax breaks. So we need to challenge things like the international trading systems that we talked about earlier, which dictate that the Global South cannot adequately invest in its people, in those who feed us. We need to, through, of course, our governments, but also in our different areas of work, to resist private property rights around things like seeds. I mean, for example, in Kenya, we are seeing the push for GMOs and how that is changing the way that the food that we have. We should be stressing things like renewable and community-owned energy, solutions like agroecology, food sovereignty, and resisting solutions that allow global powers to evade accountability. And that also means, like you have said, transforming these inequalities which determine whose voice is erased and ultimately who really suffers the most. So I think in terms of demanding accountability in the way that we do is to continue leveraging on the work, the decolonial work that has already been done, and pushing for it, and continue to show how the wealth of the Global North has come to be at the detriment of the Global South, and how our histories have changed the fabric of our societies, so that then we are getting solutions that are working for us and not those that are harming us in the long run.
Thank you so very much. Those are really, really wonderful points. you know, especially how you mentioned we need to speak up and push back on this every time, everywhere we find ourselves, you know, every space that we're in, we need to let it be known that we know what is going on and push back and speak up. And I like that you spoke about the commodification of basic needs too. That's an important area we can look at. And then, of course, the capitalism greed is something that is a huge topic on its own, you know. And it's really, you've been mentioning African farmers, and that's really something that, you know, I like us to reflect on, because basically these are the people who feed us, and life should be easier for them, you know. So before throwing the reflections to the audience, I'd like to hear from Dr. Oluwatoyin. Please, if you have a contribution to that, how we can hold the global north accountable. Dr. Oluwatoyin. Dr. Oluwatoyin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I unfortunately forgot to unmute. Yeah, so how do we hold the global north accountable? Because like we've established, historically, they are responsible for the climate change crisis that we are in now. Unfortunately, Africa and developing countries bear the greatest brunt and the burden of responding to climate change. So I would sum it up by still insisting on the need to build the capacity of African countries, and we've talked about that capacity in several respects. The capacity to build the need to build the capacity of African countries for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And this is because these key three things, it requires technology transfer, it requires capital, and of course, it requires other resources as well. And in fact, these three issues, we can look at it in terms of inter-country inequalities and intra-country inequalities. So as in inequalities between one country and another, and in fact, inequalities between within a country as well. When we talk about the inequality between different countries, then that's when the issue of climate justice comes about. And then when we talk about issues of inequality within a country, then of course we then begin to talk about the issues of access to resources, poverty issues, access to finance, land tenure security, and so many other issues. And I think that to address issues of capacity and resilience in developing country, climate finance is quite important. For me, I think that climate finance is a climate justice issue, because developed countries are historically responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, but developing countries are the most impacted and the most vulnerable to its negative to the negative impact of climate change. Unfortunately, I heard when Juanita talked about the developed countries not meeting up to their obligations with regards to financing, adaptation, mitigation, and building resilience to climate change. Because for a couple of years now, developed countries have committed to contributing $10 million yearly in climate finance, but they've consistently failed to deliver on this promise. And what we find is that loans and other kind of grants have actually been masked as climate finance. So it's quite important that there should be a decoupling. Climate finance should be climate finance, and then all those other ones should be what they are, because climate finance is a climate justice issue. One other thing that I would like to quickly point out is the importance of women in the struggle to achieve sustainable development. So we have issues of, so there is climate change, which we have said has a negative impact. And of course, achieving sustainable development, particularly the sustainable development goals, is what we are all aspiring to now. So it's important to, recognize the importance of women as important agents of change. This is because the unique knowledge that they have is key to ensuring the effectiveness and the sustainability of mitigation and adaptation resources and adaptation responses to climate change. And because of this, their full and effective participation and contribution are essential. I'd also like to point out that it's also important when we're talking about the global response and the obligations of developed countries. It's also quite important for us to also talk about the responsibilities of developing country governments. So there are responsibilities as well. So apart from, so what we're beginning to see is that a couple of African countries, for instance, have climate change legislation. But apart from having that climate change legislation, it's also important to have guidelines, policies that addresses the particular needs of vulnerable members of the society. So it's important that apart from having climate change response and adaptation mechanisms generally, or policies generally, it's important for countries to also have gender gap policies that addresses the vulnerabilities of women, of children, of persons living with disability within the society. And it is when we're able to do that, that we are then able to achieve decolonization. It's when we're able to do that, we're able to achieve equitable development, not a development that is skewed towards capitalism and neoliberalism, but development that takes into consideration the needs of the present generation without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to also meet their various needs. And it will also lead to inclusive governance, and that is governance that incorporates gender perspectives and that involves women as agents of change in the response to climate change and achieving climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Dr. Oluwatoyin and to Juanita. Thank you so much. If you're just joining us, we're speaking about the climate justice in Africa and how to disrupt the colonial values around that. Please, if you have any reflections, questions for our speakers, would like to use this opportunity to invite you to contribute. You can just raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and then you can, contribute to the conversation. But if you don't want to speak, you can drop that in the comments and I'll read them out or share them with whom you specified for them to be shared. So anyone has any questions, contributions to add? I'm seeing a hand. Is it Chesa Akubai? You have a contribution to make. Please unmute your mic.
All right, thank you so much, Nana, for this conversation so far. I want to say a big thank you to Juanita and Dr. Toyin for the insightful, reflections they've shared with us, today. I really heard you, Dr. Toyin, when you said that climate financing is a climate justice issue. And when Juanita, 1 second, please. And when Juanita mentioned that climate finance is not just in terms of finances or the thinly veiled investments that they make, that it is also about reparations, because there has been historical discrimination, there's been historical wrongs that need to be corrected to actually enable us to find ourselves in a place of equity, And I really, really appreciate that aspect, because many times when we have the conversation around climate justice, we think about, we think about the current issues, we think about, how the West, has basically centered themselves in the middle of this conversation. But I'm really appreciative to see a conversation that also speaks on our responsibility as Africans, our responsibility as a people who have gained flag independence, and the responsibility that it puts upon us to ensure that we do away with colonial legacies of binary thinking that allows us to develop societies that are skewed in terms of rights, in terms of economics and all of that stuff, and to think about the intersection that strengthens equity, basically having everybody represented, protected, via policies, via laws, via reparations, and how that can create a place for us to actually begin a productive conversation around climate justice within our countries. And I think the last reflection that you shared, both of you, that really touched me, because this conversation is something that I really, really listened to, because number one, I love listening to the two of you. Number two, I also appreciate the depth of knowledge that goes into the work around climate justice, and how much that knowledge is not public, is not democratized, how there has been a single narrative approach to it, which centers the West. And looking at an approach that centers us as African people, that centers our current issues, and centers our responsibility within the space, is a totally refreshing angle to the conversation for me. And I just really want to say thank you so much for sharing with us. And yes, absolutely, that's all from my end. I don't have a question, sorry.
Lara, I think Nana has dropped.
Oh, Nana's dropped off. Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but thank you for sharing your reflections. Yes.
Yes, the internet has been really opposition today,
yes.
but
yes, our agenda must agenda.
Absolutely.
That's doing this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The internet is a colonial construct.
I know.
They are colonial constructs indeed.
Yeah,
but this has been an interesting conversation, and thank you to Dr. Toyin and Juanita again for steering this conversation and just expanding our analysis to think critically about the impact of policies, existing policies, systems, and structures, and how we don't just want to generalize, but actually be specific about how they impact specific groups, women, and marginalized communities, and also about how climate financing is a climate justice issue, and how we must treat it as such. I don't know if Nana is back, and then if we still have more questions for our speakers, and if anyone has any other reflections, they can share. Yeah, no, it's fine. Juanita has shared like a couple of resources. Yeah, Juanita has shared a couple of resources in the chat. If Dr. Toyin is also sharing some resources, maybe later, but we'll be sharing everything plus the recording to everyone that have registered so that they can have that. Over to you, Nana.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm sorry to everyone, my connection keeps going on and off. It's raining where I am heavily too. So do we still have any reflections, questions for our speakers? Okay, in the absence of none, I think we can go ahead and contribute to the final question that we have for our speakers. So to Dr. Oluwatoyin, the very last question. With everything going on, what are some of, before we get to the point where we have held the global north accountable and the climate discourse is now decentralized, decolonized, and we are doing better with climate change. Before we get to that promised land, what are some of the approaches to survival that we as indigenous people, as Africans, as people living in developing countries can adopt to heal the deep social wounds of inequality as a result of this, climate crisis? How can we return to ecological balance?
Thank you, Nana. Thank you so much. One of the very key ways in which we can return to ecological balance is the recognition of indigenous knowledge. As a result of colonialization, indigenous knowledge, and not just indigenous knowledge with regards to the environment, even indigenous knowledge, indigenous structures with regards to governance as well. So if we take our minds back to the organic governance structure that was already that was developing in Africa in terms of the several kingdoms that Africa had, the Oyo Kingdom, the Mali Empire, also the Benin Kingdom. Those were all, institutions and structures that were developing organically. Also related to that is the issue of indigenous knowledge and our relationship with the environment. There's something called environmental ethics. If you look at our culture and our tradition, we add ways in which what is now termed as sustainable development, but we've always practiced it with our indigenous knowledge and how we related with the environment, how we exploited the environment, what we took out of the environment. So number one, it's quite important for us to go back to our indigenous knowledge. Number two, it's in order for us to heal the wound, it's quite important for us to also to carry everybody along. So the response to climate change, the governance of climate change should be not just top down, but it should be bottom up as well. So it should be top down and at the same time, it should be bottom up because we are quite interconnected with the environment, whether as a person, as an individual, or as a community. And because of that, it would be a travesty if climate governance continues to be top down. It's quite important for it to be bottom up as well, and for it to be inclusive for every member of the society, and to ensure that no one is left behind. It's also important to increase capacity, whether it's through climate finance, whether it's through technology transfer. That's another very touchy subject when we talk about, you know, the historical responsibilities of developed countries, the issue of technology transfer. I mean, there's no point sitting at the table when we go to COP28 and we talk about all of these issues and we talk about achieving zero carbon or transitioning to a low carbon economy when we do not have the technology, when we do not have the capacity and the wherewithal for us to achieve all of those aims. So it's not just about, you know, bringing African countries to the negotiating table. I mean, we've always gone to the negotiating table at climate change meetings. There's always this different blocks. There's the G77 and the G77 group, which is for the developing countries during the climate change negotiations. But it's not just enough to give us a seat at the table. It's quite important, you know, to not just give us a seat, but give us the tools that we need to achieve this holy grail of transitioning to a low carbon economy. And we could go on and on, but because of time, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. You mentioned, you know, we have to go back to our indigenous knowledge and then carry everyone along, every member of the society. And of course, you've been drumming it to increase capacity, give us the tools and not just the seat. Basically, the old saying, teach us how to fish and not just give us fish. Yes. So, Joanita, you have, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Nana. Of course, when you asked that question, I think for me, the first thing that came to my head was burn it all down and then rebuild. I feel like the way that the world is structured at this moment, and even if I said at the beginning that we shouldn't lose hope, I think that we just need everyone to go like that, like what happened with the dinosaurs. Just end humanity as it is now, because it's filled with greed and so many things that are not going to help us. But if I'm to give an answer, I think I would say that the solutions that you're asking us require us to radically reimagine new ways of being and new ways of living. And like the way that the doctor started, it's to trace. I know that our history has been erased, but to trace and sort of rebuild how our ancestors lived, because they were able to live in harmony with nature. So to trace that back and see what's left there, what we can adopt. And I think that currently there's a misalignment of spirit in the way that we live as we are living now. There's a culture of domination, there's a culture of exploitation and extraction. Everyone is asking you, how do I gain from this? And of course, we understand that it's capitalism, but I think we need to think about how we live, even as individuals. We need to think about things like building a system of care. And in such a system, there are things like reciprocity, connection, obligation, responsibility. It's shared, right? So it's shared, it's co-created, it's collective living and collective ways of being. We need to build systems where we care for each other, care for nature, care for our neighbors, really care for everyone and the environment. Things like develop development, GDP, this constant push to develop and develop at whatever cost is clearly not working, and it's no longer a thing that we need to be using. We need, instead of measuring numbers and all this, we need to measure things like happiness, things like wellness, things like leisure, love, shelter, things that actually matter for our well-being. Are the people healthy? Is the soil healthy? For me, I would say that these would actually be the signs of having a wealthy economy, everyone living in abundance. And I know that natural resources, as they are abundant and they are able to cater for everyone's needs, but because of the way that the world is set up, only a few get to enjoy this. So going back to what I started with, either we burn everything down, or if we are to stay here, it's for us to align, to realign what actually matters and who actually matters. I mean, I was in a space not long ago and Omolara was like, money it's invisible, like it's not something, it's just a social construct. So we need to think about this rat race towards money and earning at the cost of people's well-being is not sustainable, and it's not a way to live. So we need to go back to what actually matters. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you so very much. Just to recap, you're basically talking about collective living and, building a collective way of living, a community of care for not just individuals, but, also the environment. And that's really, really such an important aspect to look at. I like that you mentioned that we need to prioritize, happiness and, joy, wellness, leisure. Hopefully we'll find a way around that before you find someone who burns down everything. But we thank you so much for the contribution thus far. We'll open the floor for more reflections and questions for anyone who has before our speakers have to go. If you have any questions, reflections, commentary, whatever it is, you're welcome to share, and we want to hear from you. You can raise your hand or you can use the chat box. By the way, thank you so much to both Joanita and Dr. Oluwatoyin for sharing resources in the chat room. We're so grateful. Thank you. Okay, do we have anyone with questions? Okay, in the absence of any, to the speakers now, Joanita and Dr. Oluwatoyin, do you have any concluding remarks, any last, for us to live with, any reflections for us to live with? Okay, I can see you nodding your head, Joanita. Okay, maybe you go ahead, then Dr. Oluwatoyin goes after you.
Okay, I think for me, the concluding remarks would be that the climate crisis is not this abstract thing, right? It's already happening and it's already here. And so even when we talk about negotiating, you can't negotiate with things like nature. Nature doesn't listen to your numbers. Nature doesn't listen to, so the climate crisis is here and it's here now. And so we do not have the luxury of talking about it like it's something that's going to happen in the future. As Africans, it's something that is imminent at the moment. I mean, we have billionaires like Elon Musk who have plots of land on Mars, and they are ready to up and go at any point when things go bad. So it's important for us to talk about this as something that is as imminent as it is right now. And so even when we are negotiating, we need to push our governments, push whoever is in those negotiating rooms to not treat this as lightly as they always do, but treat it as urgent, as an urgent issue that it is. And also just to remind us as Africans that we need to always acknowledge the historic inequalities that have been caused to us. And so even when we are pushing for demands, is to push for things that restitute and that hold to account those who are responsible. Yeah, thanks. And thank you for this session.
Thank you so much. We're so grateful. Thank you. Dr. Luateng, any last reflections to leave us with?
Thank you very much. I'm going to end on a gender-based perspective, and I'm just going to say that, despite the gender-based vulnerabilities, it's a mistake to assume that women are simply victims in the face of climate change. Women are not just victims, they are important change agents in the response in our desire to mitigate, to adapt, and also to build resilience to climate change, not just in Africa, but all over the world. So it's important to give women a seat at the table during these negotiations. Thank you.
All right, thank you so very much. It's been honestly such a wonderful, insightful, conversation. And it's important that we have these conversations if we are to, move forward and do better for our continent that we love so much. I think to conclude, I'm just really, all of us at Liberation Alliance Africa are just really grateful that you all joined us and, shared your thoughts and reflections. The webinar is recorded. It will be shared once in a few days. It will be shared and sent to everyone who registered. And the resources too, we'll share those. We've shared the link to our newsletter in the chat, so that you can do that platform. An addition of the BCL series, like Toby mentioned in the beginning, the first was on leadership. This is on climate justice. We'll have 3 more through the year, and then we'll share information on when that's happening, with everyone on our social media platform. We're at Liberation Alliance on most of the platforms. And we really want to thank Dr. Luateng and Joanita. We're deeply honored. Thank you both so much for, taking the time out to be with us today, for sharing your knowledge with us, and, the resources that you've shared with us. We're really grateful. Thank you so very much. Like I said, you'll be updated on the upcoming webinar. So from myself and the rest of the team, we want to thank you once more and wish you a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and stay safe and keep the liberation fire burning. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. We are so, so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We leave you in solidarity always. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Liberation Alliance Africa.
Thank you too. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. Thank you for joining. Okay, I'm going to end this now.